The last time I was in Ojai was in 2010, when I was invited to present a talk on whether it's really possible to be free from conditioning. I wonder if you've thought about that notion and would answer the question, what is freedom? What's conditioning? And trying to attain freedom from it. I'm sure many of you have thoughts about that. It's delightful to be back here after so many years and to see a lot of old friendly faces and make acquaintance with new ones. I'm actually looking forward to meeting some of the scholars that have been invited here as well to gather and talk. But mostly I'm actually interested in meeting others, those of you who have actually come to attend this conference on the self more broadly. Some of you probably have great familiarity with Krishnamurti's thought, and others less so. But I think that sometimes fresh, as well as well thought out perspectives are useful, certainly for me, who has trodden over this territory quite often. And I find that new and old sometimes bring about questions that cause me to rethink issues that I thought I had given attention to and that haven't really done adequately. So I'm really looking forward to the weekend interactions with all of you. Now, I first came to Ojai, I first came here in the 1980s, and I lived in a shack in a teepee at the base of Topa Topa Mountain. I had long hair in those days. Most of the time, I was basically learning how to garden and walking in Los Padres National Forest. So I have very fond memories of this place. When I come back, it sort of suddenly triggers old thoughts, feelings, memories, and so on. It's great to see Denny back there, who still has his long hair and beard. Sadly, I don't. So the theme, thanks to Yap's so comprehensive introduction, is the self. And I was invited to speak on Krishnamurti's perspective on the self. Krishnamurti spoke for 50 years, almost every other day on the topic. And I've got 45 minutes or so to do it in, so you'll get the summary version. Before I do, though, I want to make an important point. As I understand him, Krishnamurti didn't want anyone to act as an authoritative interpreter of his teachings. He felt that each person should read or listen to him and come to their own understanding. He did encourage us, though, to dig into what he had to say and to scrutinize it thoroughly. Ultimately, I think he didn't want us to be trapped in endless intellectual analyses, but hoped we might discover the truth for ourselves, to which he pointed. I respect this. And in a way, I'm only kind of here trying to offer my perspective on what I understand Krishnamurti's teachings to be, drawn from my academic study of him, but also from my own insights and realizations. So without any further ado, let me just jump right in. If I had to put what I think Krishnamurti had to say, or would likely say about the self in a single sentence, it's this. The self is among the thought-constructed entities that arise when love and intelligence are absent. Now, that may sound quite radical, and it certainly needs a lot of unpacking for us to appreciate if that is actually what Krishnamurti's perspective is. Perhaps I just made it up. Or I've misunderstood him terribly, both of which are possible. And if he is actually saying what I just said about the relationship among love, intelligence, and the self, what might he mean by it? So in support of my summary statement, let me just consider these quotes, the gist of which we'll return to hopefully at the end of this talk. I quote, this is Krishnamurti, "You say, I love. But then in the very saying of it, in the very experiencing of it, love is not. But when you know love, self is not. When there is love, self is not. And in another context, he said, intelligence is only possible when there's real freedom from the self, from the me. That is, when the mind is no longer the center of the demand for the more, no longer caught up in the desire for greater, wider, more expansive experience. So we immediately see that Krishnamurti places the self in a sort of relationship with love and intelligence. Now, a naive interpretation of these quotes might cause one to say something such as, one must negate or destroy the self for love and intelligence to exist. This often appears to be the thrust of many religious traditions, particularly certain Eastern ones, in which one strives to overcome egotism in order to attain a state of selflessness. The struggle with the ego drives people into a dizzying array of practices such as extremes in diet, long wakeful vigils, trance-inducing chanting, and other powerful applications of willpower. In certain non-dual philosophies, such as Vedanta, one tries to overcome the limitations of the ego-constructed self and merge with a greater supreme self, known as Brahman. Many people think that this is what Krishnamurti too is saying. The study of the self, they think, is really about trying to overcome this little false self and to discover the big, true self. This is also the way they may understand the notion of self-knowledge, which Krishnamurti definitely promotes. Let me quote him again as an example of why people sometimes think he's speaking about merging with the larger self. So in one context, he said this, and I quote, I wish I had PowerPoint so you could read the quotes simultaneously. I didn't realize I could do that. Self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. Self-knowledge is cultivated through the individual's search for himself. I'm not putting the individual in opposition to the mass. They are not antithetical. You, the individual, are the mass, the result of the mass. As long as we regard ourselves as individuals apart from the whole, competing, obstructing, opposing, sacrificing the many for the particular, or the particular for the many, all those problems that arise out of this conflicting antagonism will have no happy and enduring solution, for they are the result of wrong thinking, feeling. Clearly, Krishnamurti is calling for self-knowledge. And this leads some to jump to the conclusion that he's referring to a realization of a larger, true self, which will reveal itself when one is free from a limiting sense of self. He did say, we regard ourselves as individuals apart from the whole, and thus in resonance with this, you might hear some people who have read Krishnamurti repeat one of his many powerful statements, such as, you are the world. They see such statements as clear enunciations that Krishnamurti means we are actually one with a larger reality, a bigger self. If only we can get past our little ego-constructed selves. But it is possible that they misunderstand Krishnamurti by jumping to this formulation found in various monistic philosophies of oneness. Even in the passage I quoted above, Krishnamurti says, I'm not putting individuals in opposition to the mass. They are not antithetical. Now, Krishnamurti did not deny the existence of some kind of self. A you and a me that responds when we are called, a me who owns its own toothbrush and underwear. This is crucial because in some idealistic philosophical and religious teachings, this relative self is said not to really exist at all. It's just an illusion. But here's how Krishnamurti characterizes the self, and again I quote, do we know what we mean by the self? By that, meaning the self, I mean the ideal, the memory, the conclusion, the experience, the various forms of nameable and unnameable intentions, the conscious endeavor to be or not to be, the accumulated memory of the unconscious, the racial, the group, the individual, the clan, and the whole of it all, whether it is projected outwardly in action or projected spiritually as a virtue. The striving after all this is the self. What's intriguing in this description is that Krishnamurti appears to include a much wider array of phenomena as constituting the self than simply the me with my toothbrush and underwear. In fact, if we look more closely at that description, I'm not sure I even see the me with my toothbrush at all. He mentions the idea, the memory, the conclusion, the experience, intentions both nameable and unnameable, conscious striving, unconscious memory, be it individual or collective, and the actions that derive from these phenomena. Most remarkably, the self in this description seems to be simply a constellation of mental phenomena and behaviors that derive from those movements in consciousness. In that same quote, he goes on to say, in it, that is the self, is included the competition, the desire to be. The whole process of that is the self. And we know actually, when we are faced with it, that it is an evil thing. I'm using the word evil intentionally because the self is dividing. The self is self-enclosing. Its activities, however noble, are separative and isolating. So here too, there's an absence of physicality, if I may use that word, in his description of the self, which is a process, the desire to be, as he puts it. Quite significantly, Krishnamurti intentionally calls the self evil. Unusual. That jumped out at me. Because he assesses its nature to be isolating and its actions as divisive, even when they appear to be whole. So there's definitely a problem with the self as framed in the complex manner in which Krishnamurti understands it. Central to its problematic nature is its tendency towards divisiveness and isolation. Let me quote another passage by him just to emphasize again his rejection of the notion of merging with the larger oneness. The reason I'm hammering on this a little bit is because regardless of how one frames it, there's always a sense that when this goes, there's something larger that one becomes part of. So here he's discussing dealing with the problem of the self. I quote, "Religious and other groups have explained it," by it he means the handling of the divisive nature of the self, "by identification, have they not? Identify yourself with the larger and the self disappears." That's what they say. We say here that identification is still the process of the self. The larger is simply the projection of the me, which I experience and which therefore strengthens the me. I wonder if you're following all this. All the various forms of discipline, beliefs, and knowledge only strengthen the self. Now, unlike many of you who knew Krishnamurti very well, I only saw and heard him speak once, here in Ojai in the Oak Grove. I can assure you that he appeared to me to have a very healthy sense of self, in the typical way we understand that term. He didn't stumble around not knowing why people had gathered. They had come to hear him speak. He took a position on the chair that was placed on the dais for him. He answered questions addressed to him, and so on. I'm sure that he eventually went back to his home and slept in his bed. Those types of senses of oneself appear to most people to be sane and healthy. We would wonder about the sanity of someone who is supposedly so immersed in some vast oneness that they don't know when their name is being called or eat from someone else's plate when they're served a meal. Now, there are some people who might regard that sort of consciousness as a mark of a great saint, fully absorbed in the totality and unable to distinguish self from other. But Krishnamurti clearly did not embody that sort of absence of self, nor does he appear to be pointing us in that direction in his discourses. According to Krishnamurti, as I understand him, the self is put together by what he often broadly calls thought. Thought arises out of an interplay among perception, memory, prior knowledge, sensation, and experience, and generates the sense of self, which he also calls the I, the me, or the center. This quote somewhat illustrates his teaching on this point. Quote, there is perception, sensation, contact, and desire. And the mind becomes the mechanical instrument of this process, in which symbols, words, objects are the center around which all desire, all pursuits, all ambitions are built. That center is the me. So the center, or the self, is constructed through our ongoing experiences, in which our perceptions, mediated by sensations, memories, and our desires, produce a thought-constructed sense of self. This thought-constructed self is driven by sensation, among other things, and continues to perpetuate itself in a sort of mechanical fashion. Let me quote him again to support my presentation of this perspective. He says, quote, my mind is always experiencing in terms of sensation. It is the instrument of sensation. Being bored with a particular sensation, I seek a new sensation, which may be what I call a realization of God, but it's still sensation. I've had enough of this world and its travail, and I want peace, the peace that is everlasting. So I meditate, control, I shape my mind in order to experience that peace. The experiencing of that peace is still sensation. So my mind is the mechanical instrument of sensation, of memory, a dead center from which I act, think. The objects I pursue are the projections of the mind as symbols from which it derives sensations. So now in response to all of this, you might simply ask, so what? Why is it useful to know about the self, how it arises, how it operates, and so on? Big deal. So I seek sensations, new experiences. What's the problem with that? Isn't that what gives life its meaning? Makes it worth living, keeps it interesting, gratifying, and so on. These are certainly legitimate and significant questions. Krishnamurti would likely respond that this sort of existence is incomplete, perhaps paralleling the famous dictum of Socrates that an unexamined life is not worth living. As mentioned in that quote above, the unexamined life is a mechanical, robotic existence, not marked by genuine freedom. When we construct ourselves based on our thinking and experiences, we set about on a path of isolation. And a path of achievement, which is a form of escape from reality, an escape that ironically ultimately feeds our dissatisfaction. These painful aspects of our misguided escapes reveal themselves to us in global and personal conflicts, and in contradiction, confusion, and unhappiness. So Krishnamurti says, that is the first thing to see, that you are not different from sorrow. You are sorrow. You are anxiety, loneliness, pleasure, pain, fear, the sense of isolation. You are all that. So Krishnamurti is pointing to a deep interconnectedness among all things, so that the world and its problems, be they environmental, economic, political, and so on, are intrinsically related to the self. I quote, there's personal sorrow and the sorrow of the world. There's the sorrow of ignorance and the sorrow of time. This ignorance is the lack of knowing oneself, and the sorrow of time is the deception that time can cure, heal, and change. He again emphasizes the vital function of self-knowledge. A little bit later in that same talk, he says very bluntly, knowing oneself is the ending of sorrow. So that's why it's relevant. So evidently the theme of our conference, from Krishnamurti's perspective, is not just some passing curiosity. It's at the very hub of his teachings. One might reasonably say that from Krishnamurti's perspective, the self is at the hub of all human concerns, all human endeavors, all human conflicts, both personal and global. Now, you know probably from my introduction that I'm a university professor. And in the context of certain Asian philosophy classes, I sometimes ask my students, what do you find most fascinating in life? Or I sometimes say, what are you most preoccupied with in your life? And they give me answers such as happiness, peace, truth, money, some of the more honest ones, family, the environment, health. But my students rarely answer, quote, I'm most fascinated and preoccupied with myself, which is likely the honest response. Perhaps I don't get that answer because we are raised to pretend that such self-interest edges perilously close to an unhealthy narcissism. Perhaps this conflict between self-interest and the need to pretend to not be so self-preoccupied plays a role in our lack of self-understanding. We are discouraged from learning about the self. To Krishnamurti, understanding about the self is vital in order to live a life that is free from sorrow, a life that is fulfilling, non-mechanical, passionate, and truly free. These may seem like big claims, but Krishnamurti asserts, and again I quote, the most thoughtful people must be aware that the self, the me, the I, is really the cause of all our mischief and all of our misery. I think the most thoughtful people are aware of it. One can see that most religious organizations theorize and vaguely insist on how essential it is that the me, the self, should be completely abandoned. Unless we understand this whole complex process, there is no possibility of peace in the world. We know this. We are aware of this fact consciously or unconsciously, but yet in our everyday life, it does not play any part. We do not bring it into reality. So, clearly the thoughtful people who have gathered here for this conference, and every one of the countless seekers of spiritual liberation, radical psychological transformation, or whatever you prefer to call it, deeply understand and value this notion of profound self-understanding. In fact, many have dedicated their entire lives, energies, and fortunes in the pursuit of this goal. Perhaps with the right teacher, such as with someone whom they can believe is truly liberated. Perhaps with the right approach, with the right kind of meditation that they can trust is truly effective. Perhaps in the right environment, such as in a beautiful natural place, away from the hubbub and distractions of everyday life. Perhaps with those things, they too might one day be free. After all, what else can you do? Truly following the wrong teacher, the wrong approach, and being in the wrong environment doesn't sound like the right way to go about this. But these oppositions between right and wrong are precisely the type of false dichotomies that grip the thinking mind, and which Krishnamurti urges us to recognize. The self is just a bundle of conditioned phenomena, shaped by past experiences, and the thoughts that emanate from those experiences are like ripples on a pond. Thoughts color new perceptions and experiences, shaping and reshaping the me, moment by moment, at this very moment. One does not need a teacher, a technique, or a proper place. You, aware, here, now, is the beginning and the end. This is why one of the self's biggest assets in self-construction and self-preservation is time. Time is one of the key obstacles to freedom. Time moves us away from here and now into there and then. Again, I quote, the very factor of conditioning in the past, in the present, and in the future is the me, which thinks in terms of time. The me which exerts itself, and now it exerts itself in the demand to be free. So, the root of all conditioning is the thought which is the me. The me is the very essence of the past. The me is time. The me is sorrow. The me endeavors to be free from itself. The me makes efforts, struggles to achieve, to deny, to become. This struggle to become is time, in which there is confusion and the greed for the more and the better. So at the core of his teachings then, Krishnamurti urges us to remain with the ever-shifting dynamism of what is. What is what is occurring at this moment, outwardly and inwardly. Our tendency to move away from what is driven by such factors as fear and desire, the wish to be or experience reality other than as it presents itself to us at this moment. If what is experienced as pleasant, we long for more of it. But if it's unpleasant, we want it to stop. Both these movements are desire in action. The highly unpredictable nature of what is may trigger feelings of anxiety, particularly if we grasp after ideas about a quality of life that is secure, predictable, free from fear, and peaceful. Reality seems to be capricious. What is far too fickle, far too changeable, far too creative. In essence, we move away from the insecurity of what is into a much more secure, imaginary reality created by our thoughts. That reality is made up of a thought-constructed self, a thought-constructed world, and thought-constructed purposes that enable us to move through our lives. Any movement away from what is, of course, into these imaginary realms is a form of escape. We escape into our plans, our dreams, our purposes, our goals, our hopes, and so on. One day I will be at peace. One day I will be free of anger. One day I will overcome my fear of death. One day I will be a spiritual teacher that people actually listen to, and so on. Of course, if one simply pauses to reflect on it, one can never truly move away from what is. Because what is exactly what's occurring at this present moment. Our thought-constructed reality is not different from what is, but is merely a small fragment of it. In common parlance, we live in bubbles. The creative movement of what is, constantly dissolves the boundaries of our bubbles, and we find ourselves anxiously and repeatedly reconstructing ourselves and the world. If only I had a bit more self-discipline, I could stick to my diet and exercise regimen. If only I had a bit more money, I could relax and be free from this constant grind. If only my partner was a bit more caring and loving, I would be satisfied in this relationship. In other words, if I could only change, or if others would change, or if the world changed, then life would be as it should, instead of being fundamentally unsatisfactory. But the fact is that you, others, and the world are constantly changing. Only they're not always changing in the way that you might like or want. This process of constant self-construction and repeated self-dissolution may cause us fear and sorrow, both emotions or sensations that are unpleasant. However, instead of remaining keenly aware of this process in order to understand it, we tend to escape into newer bubbles that we hope will insulate us from the pain of self-dissolution and dissatisfaction. But if we remain with our conflict, confusion, fear, or sorrow, we might actually discover something extraordinary. Sorrow actually can serve as a catalyst for discovery if one doesn't move away from it or attempt to escape it. Krishnamurti has compared it to a flame, the flame of discontent. Let me quote him again. The flame of discontent, because it has no outlet, because it has no object in which it can fulfill itself, that flame becomes a great passion. That passion is intelligence. That intensity brings about a quality of mind having a deep insight instantly into things. And from that, there is action. It is an action that is without cause and motive. It is an action which is always free. It is an action that is only possible when there is insight born of intelligence. And so we have returned to intelligence. The natural arising of thought within consciousness in response to what is intrinsic to who and what we are. Thought plays an immensely important role in our lives, enabling us to communicate and create. It lets me pick up my toothbrush and put on my underwear. However, when the nature of this process, through which thought in relationship to all of reality constructs the self, the I, and the me, when that process is not adequately understood, we find ourselves gripped by conflict and sorrow, a sorrow that collectively contributes to our conflict, the conflict in the world. So Krishnamurti is urging us to remain with that sorrow and conflict, to be choicelessly aware of it, rather than to choose to escape from it into an ideological, thought-constructed solution. True, thought has been invaluable in enabling human beings to find solutions to the many problems that we face in life. Instead of standing out in the open, cold, and rain-soaked, we learned through thought to first find and eventually construct shelters for ourselves. But just as a knife cannot cut itself, thought is not particularly effective at enabling us to understand thought in action. But awareness is. Thought chooses to move awareness into a bubble. Each thought blows a sort of bubble, some of which are self-enclosing. Choiceless awareness requires one to begin from here, from now, from this place of intrinsic freedom. That freedom enables a quality of direct perception, of deep insight into what is. Let me get back to Krishnamurti in case you fear that I've put words into his mouth. He says, the I is the result of the world. The you is the result of the world. And to the man who sees this deeply with a profound insight, there is no you and I. Therefore, that profound insight is compassion, which is intelligence. So let me conclude by coming full circle. I suggested in the beginning of this talk that Krishnamurti saw a relationship between intelligence, love, and the self. And we have seen from the quote above that with profound insight into the nature of reality, there's no you and I. He called this compassion and intelligence. But what about love? To Krishnamurti, these are utterly interrelated. In a conversation with the renowned theoretical physicist David Bohm, Krishnamurti once said, he said, because compassion is related to intelligence, there is no intelligence without compassion. And compassion can only be when there's love, which is completely free of all remembrances, personal jealousies, and so on. So the thought-constructed self, sheltered and isolated within the membrane of its thought-constructed world, its bubble, suffers from a separateness that inhibits intelligence and the full flowering of creativity. Action that emerges from such separation and isolation is not holistic and is inevitably distorted. This is also why I don't understand Krishnamurti to be saying that we are actually one with some greater oneness or unity. To think or imagine that is to create an abstraction that is simply another bubble within what is. And that's a movement away from, an escape from our already isolated and conflicted reality. Now we grasp at oneness or wholeness, and in the process further alienate ourselves from what is here with us now. We have relinquished examining the bubbles of our petty little selves and imaginatively inhabit or pursue an equally petty bubble that we imagine as the sacred wholeness of something grander. Krishnamurti points us repeatedly to the petty bubbles that we repeatedly fabricate, which are ourselves. To understand the self, one merely needs to see the process through which it repeatedly arises. The self often arises when thought moves. Thought cannot see this movement because it is the movement. But sensitive awareness can perceive the process through which thought arises and repeatedly constructs the self. Directed awareness is set in motion by thought, by the self. Directed awareness is crucial for most branches of learning. This is why we are habituated to use directed awareness to solve our problems. But directed awareness is limited when trying to understand the self. Directed awareness is at the basis of most spiritual techniques, such as the repetition of mantras, creative visualizations, and so on. Directed awareness cannot discover thought or the self because it is the result or effect of the thought-constructed self-driven activity. Directed awareness intrinsically sets us on a path away from our destination. Using directed awareness to find the self is like being in a windowless room lit by a candle and blowing out the flame in order to find the source of light. Directed awareness constrains our freedom to discover the full spectrum of what is. Choiceless awareness, by contrast, is fundamentally free. The self cannot be choicelessly aware. Choiceless awareness reveals the mechanisms of directed awareness. Only from the ever-present and timeless freedom of choiceless awareness, in which there is no self, is there the possibility of discovering, understanding, genuine relationship, intelligence, and compassion. Krishnamurti ties all of these foregoing themes together wonderfully in this passage. Again, I quote, "Intelligence is possible only when there is real freedom from the self, from the me. When one knows oneself as one is, without an accumulating center, out of that self-knowing comes the intelligence which can meet life. And that intelligence is creative. You will never get it through your practice of meditation, through your prayers for the more, or your escapes from the more. That reality can come only into being when you understand the state of your own mind, the malice, the envy, the complex reactions as they arise from moment to moment every day. In understanding these things, there comes a state which may be called love. That love is intelligence, and it brings a creativeness which is timeless." Krishnamurti points us not to my awareness, my intelligence, my compassion, my love, myself, or my life, but to life itself, timelessly blossoming in unfathomable creativity. I'll end with a quote. "When one makes an abstraction in thought, one moves away from what is. But one will never know what love is through abstraction. Will not know the enormous beauty, depth, and significance of love." Thank you. That's my presentation of K. And I hope I've done some of him justice. Of course. Yeah, sure. It's the best part. Krishna.
Isn't the inner personality a shape of the mind which functions through the brain, and therefore as real as the physical body? Do you think that by itself constitutes the self, or is it the fact that we get attached to it, we identify with it, call it the me because it is so useful in life, and then use it for seeking security, both physical and psychological? That makes for the ego process. In other words, is the content of memory in itself the self, or the way we look at it, relate with it, use it, creates the sense of self? Is the question clear?
Not exactly.
Okay, I'll give an example. It's easier to understand about the body. If I become very vain about being handsome or the color of my skin and so on, I can become racist, or I can become proud and vain and so on. And that obviously is a manifestation of the ego. But I do have a body. And if I don't bring in those elements, it doesn't create the self by itself. Its presence is not the self. It's like saying the property doesn't create the self, but I approach it in a self-centered way, then that creates the self. Now, isn't that also true of the contents of our memory, which is our personality? Because there is that personality. Each one of us has a certain knowledge, certain environment. I can't erase those memories. So personality is as much a fact. It's a shape of my brain, inner shape of the brain or memory, as there is shape of my body or skin and so on.
So what are you asking?
So I'm asking, is the content of the memory itself the creator of the self, or the way I use it and relate it creates the self?
Like,
or you want to differentiate this as self and that as ego?
no,
No.
I think part of that inner process is the idea of the self. I'm not so sure that there's necessarily a faculty of attaching to something, right? One of the manifestations of the inner thought is somewhat, I think there's a tendency for us to, because we identify so much with thought, to think of thought as a non-physical, non-material thing. We think thought is me. Thought is the real me, right? So that's the problem. So we look at the physicality of our body and go, clearly, I'm identifying with my body. Look, it's changing. But my thoughts, that's the real me. That sense of self that we sort of get. There's an identification with a particular material phenomenon, which is a set of thinking, memory complexes, and so on. I think that this is a fundamental error in our lack of self-understanding. The absolute material nature of thought, which is just a mechanical process of neurons firing and so on based on the experiences that we're accumulating through perceptions and so on. We identify with that cluster of stuff as the real me. And the other stuff we're willing to forego. Okay, I'm not my car, that's outside of me, and I'm not my body, look, it's changing over time. And so on. But my political affiliations and so on and so forth, well, that's the real me. So I don't know if I'm getting at your question. But that stuff, that I think the sense is that the idea, there's a certain small subset of thoughts of self which we identify with as self. But they're really just part of this material flow that is happening around us at this moment. And when there's something that we don't like that arises, we distance ourselves. Oh, that's not me. I'm not a racist. I don't think that way. I'm like this, and so on. So that's the isolating divisive nature, where we want to adhere to particular groupings of what arises internally, some people externally too, but it's just some aspects of reality are, for some reason, cut out and collated into what we would like to call self. And that gets shaken up every moment by what someone calls us, our interactions, what we eat, the way we feel, and so on. And this is terrifying because the self is constantly shifting, because it never was really ultimately there to begin with in any real way, in any substantive way. It's just like looking at bark of a tree and seeing a face in it and going, oh, that's so wonderful there, but we've come to identify with it. Or it's something we do all the time, which is to take reality and impose in some sense upon it some form, some term, something concrete, perhaps because we have a sense of security of navigating through life that way. At least that's the way I sort of understand what Kay seems to be pointing to. Yeah, I thought there was another question. I think David had one, and then we'll come to you, just because he had his hand up earlier. So
you mentioned that even Krishnamurti had his own toothbrush, and he didn't eat off of someone else's plate, and so on. So if we say that the self, as he refers to it, as thought constructed entity, and if we say that, what happens when you do away with that thought constructed entity? I gather from what you're saying that there remains some, let's call it a residual sense of self that recognizes my plate instead of someone else's plate, etc. So my question is, could you characterize a little bit more fully what is the nature of that residual sense of self which continues on after the thought constructed entity falls away? And I ask this question partly with respect to our previous conversation about whether there may be other species, chimpanzees or a dog or a dolphin, which also has some sense of self. Maybe that sense of self corresponds with, what I'm calling the residual sense of self that remains after the thought constructed entity is seen to be an illusion.
I'm not sure there is one. That is to say, I mean, thought is a pretty broad term in the way Krishnamurti uses it. It's not just the way we think of thought, which is some mental cognition that comes about. Any image making, anything that we use to somehow apprehend this and partition it so that I see and recognize that's prey, or that's something I should run away from, and so on, in an animal species. There's still some forms of recognition that this bit of reality is friendly, this bit of reality is unfriendly, and so on. It doesn't necessarily take the form of, oh, this is, food and this is not. That is thought as far as K is concerned. Each of those things that arise constitute the self, the sense of self. But without them, I'm not sure there's anything else. I mean, Krishnamurti doesn't necessarily, there's nothing other than that. That's constantly manifesting and allows you to navigate in this world. To think there's something other than that is to create an idea about something that exists apart from that. All that is existing is what is manifesting at this moment. And when that's seen through and recognized, the immensity, when that falls away, when that is not there, it cannot be known, because it doesn't lend itself to being transformed into an image or an idea. Because the moment you do that, the moment you take away that relative, the small bubble of self, that cannot be known.
Then it's not clear to me what remains that you're referring to when Krishnamurti sees, oh, that's the chair I'm supposed to sit in, this is my toothbrush,
Yeah.
that's mine.
Well, what do you mean, when he sees that, or when he doesn't see it?
When he acknowledges that's the chair that I'm supposed to sit in,
Yeah.
what is the I that remains, even though the thought constructed entity is gone?
Well, there is a thought constructed entity that says that's my chair, and that's what I'm sitting in. That's not a problem. So from my understanding, Krishnamurti's idea that this relative self, the self that responds, that has a sense of I, that puts on my shoes and answers, that is part of the way we function in the world. That arises in response to what is. That is non-problematic because it's situational and it occurs as part of this dynamic flow. What is problematic is a kind of a hanging on to it in a particular way. It's as if one wants a sense of self that puts together all that has happened in the past and that might happen in the future, rather than a self that responds, or something, a response to what is going on in the moment. In the moment, things are flowing. There is a response without necessarily a sense of self. Sometimes there has to be. Someone calls you by your name and you respond by your name. There's a constellation of ideas that all kind of converge in you asserting your sense of self in the moment. But once that moment is gone, it's gone. It doesn't need to abide and doesn't need to be situated within something broader, because that sense of something broader is an idea that it exists within. I'm not so sure if I'm either getting your question or answering it effectively, and we may have to talk further on it.
So there's no categorical sense of the illusion of the self. The self just comes and goes according to circumstances.
Yeah. I thought, I wouldn't know. I mean, my sense is that, yeah, the self is there when it needs to be, when it arises, when it needs to be in response to what is, and when those circumstances are not there, the self is not, and it needs not be there. It may arise when the thought of self arises within you, and if you're aware of that, you recognize and there will be seeing the arising of a memory of self, and so on. The self is there when it is there. Other than that, I don't know what there is. There's this. So you had a question first, yeah.
I just comment on the earlier. I just wanted to comment on the earlier question about memories being the shape of the brain and therefore a necessary constituent in the fabric of our mental existence. I'm not providing an answer. I'm not even asking a question. I just want to remark that in Hinduism, of the 4 or 5 attributes, the man, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta, they make a distinction between the two entities, the man and the chitta. Man being just like a passive storehouse of all the memories. And in that sense, it's fairly harmless. But it is the chitta that actively acts and processes them. And that's when they become a fabric of who you are. And there is a obviously danger of conditioning in that. So I think it's interesting that that distinction is made. And I just wanted to comment that if we sort of go by that, then the answer would be, if you are actively processing that storehouse, then there is a danger of conditioning. And in the same lieu, what you said in the end about Krishnamurti saying, the choiceless awareness, it kind of makes sense. It's almost as if it's like the natural selection equivalent of the mental realm, because that's when you're not putting all eggs in one basket. You're letting, it's hard to speak in abstract, but the healthiest or the most true ones survive without your affecting them by your existence. Those two things seem in congruence with each other. That's it.
Well, thank you for those comments. Yeah, I mean, technically in Sankhya philosophy and yoga philosophy, manas is sort of heart, mind, and so on. You have ahankara, so that they create a category of something that attaches self and I, and then buddhi exists, and those three collectively form chitta, right? The sense of but buddhi discriminates between whatever true and false, right, wrong, and so on. But yes, I mean, without those, Krishnamurti would probably say, if I can speak, giving his perspective, that again, those are just mind's attempt to construct categories to help us make sense of this inner world. But are they ultimately beneficial, all right, to what it is that one is maybe trying to understand? Sure, looking in, trying to categorize, and so on are all beneficial, provided one doesn't get so caught up in it that it becomes something that causes one sorrow and suffering, right? The thing is that we find ourselves conflicted. You know, this is the problem that sort of arises. Because we identify unknowingly, typically, with a particular set of ideas. We want to know, to have intellectually, through our thoughts or something that we can latch on to. And that's this quest for a security that is, perhaps misplaced. Because we come into existence insecure and without any sense of self to some extent. And then I don't know what the process is through which that sort of happens, and we somehow get misguided. I think that Krishnamurti is not pointing us to something other than whatever truth happens to be. If there is, let's say there's a truth about this, that's what we're being pointed to. That's what we're trying to understand. And in a way, he's saying quite often what we're doing with that is we're misunderstanding it, we're misguided. So, but he's not asking us to become something. He's asking us to, in some sense, to discover something. I thought I saw another hand. Yep.
I just wondering why the interesting thing that appearance of Krishnamurti happened in the same time, in a similar time as appearance of a little earlier Maxwell and thermodynamics and entropy, and then Einstein coming and quantum physics, and of course Buddhism, new uprising of Buddhism in the West. And all was moving in a direction of question, how real is real? And the point was not to dismiss the real, to dismiss the samsara, but more to put samsara in a proper place where it belongs, not to see samsara as absolute, as all there is. Then all is left to fix it. So I think the same with that goes the self. The perceptual formation of the phenomenal world, or in a broader sense, ontology of man, happened, although it is a fabrication, we needed orientation. Otherwise, we have no orientation if there's no phenomenal world. But orientation taken in a sense of absoluteness, then we have a problem of the self. And shift goes then from thing in itself to thing, I am that thing, myself. So I think in exploring the thing and realizing that it is a fake, that it's fake, that it's a fabrication, thing doesn't disappear. It's not negated, it's not transcended, nor it is transformed into another higher thing. Just gets transparent, and in that transparency, there is the ego or the self becomes thing in itself. And I call it, this is attenuated ego. And there is no problem.
That's yeah.
And,
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's the classical thing they use in Indian philosophies is the analogy of the snake and the rope, and that a person sees something they think is a snake, and then they're scared by it, and then they look closer, another person, and then discovers it's just a rope. And so the snake is gone, and there's only the rope.
Actually, the rope is there, but it's not scary anymore.
The rope is there, it's not scary anymore. What I'd like to say is that the snakiness of the rope is still there. Because the real understanding is not just having the the snake vanish entirely. The scariness of the snake, which is an illusion, vanishes. But the fact that this rope looks like a snake is present, which means then one is able to operate with both the snake and the rope, not just the rope. We tend to, when we hear that story, we want to only see ropes. And all we're actually seeing is snakes. But when you see snake and rope, we're like, no, you actually see and understand. True empowerment comes from understanding the snakiness of the rope, because that's what life really is. People seeing snakes, generally, not seeing ropes. You know? I don't know if that's the way I take your.
I would just also add to this that when thing is seen for what it is, it becomes, by being transparent. In Zen, there is a statement of dead thinking, no dash thing, not nothing, but no dash thing. That means instead of thing now, we have a density of the whole universe. So density of the whole universe is something different than a fragment of thingness. And I think this is where this relativity is understood really. Then you get shift from thing to no dash thing. And then there's no problem in that.
Sorry. Okay. Oh, there's a whole stack. I'm not sure. I missed the sequence. Jab, did you see who was? Maybe Patikure. We haven't asked you something. Oh, was there someone? Was there a question back?
Just a comment. If I can make a comment right now, and obviously I'm thinking about the words I'm going to say and all that, or some processes going on. What makes it necessary to have the add-on that I'm doing it? It seems like an extra and unnecessary thought that's added to and in language I would say that I'm doing it, but actually I could also say there's talking right now. So, but there's this automatic tendency to claim ownership of the comment, but it doesn't seem necessary to make the comment. So why is there that automatic, unnecessary add-on? Because as I'm sitting here and talking, I don't really have a sense that I'm doing it. But if someone were to ask me later, did you make that comment? I would say, yes, I made that comment. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's like a way of explaining that. I don't know, it's a way of but it's not necessary actually to make the comment.
Yeah, I think that's part of a social conditioning, right? Because from the time we were reared and raised, I mean, I guess animals have less of that. I don't understand how they really think, but we as people, I mean, I sort of go, oh, that was something interesting you said, and what about, I mean, all from the time we were born, all through our lives, we're sort of nurtured and conditioned to take ownership of the things that we say, do, write, and so on. As academics, we definitely want to be cited, but you quote us and all the rest of it. So, but in the actual doing of it, there is no need for ownership or sense of ownership. I mean, in the Taoist tradition and so on, they say the enlightened sage just speaks what comes in his head, you know, his tongue speaks freely, but he's not really thinking that I'm saying this thing, you know, it's just a flow of energy and consciousness and so on. But the sense of ownership is where the self arises. And if one is aware of that, you see this process and you go, well, that's interesting. I wonder why that happens. Well, that makes for an interesting exploration. But it's a process that occurs. But you can problematize it and go, oh, I shouldn't be taking ownership. You know, this is what one of the insidious things with the spiritual path is. It's about taking ownership is your ego in action. You ought not to do that. Oh my gosh, I've just taken ownership of everything I do and say, and I ought not to be doing that. Why is that happening? It is such a problem. So, there you go, you know.
From what I understand, then you're saying that the sense of I is not an individual construct, but a social one.
I imagine so. I don't know. Maybe you're right. Yeah. It seems to be a social construct. Certainly socially perpetuated. And David, I guess, and I think Patrick.
We say self is a thought-constructed entity. Is that entity a false entity, an illusion, or is it not?
What do you mean by an illusion?
False. Is it like like an hallucination, something that we think is there and it has no substance? It's not, in fact, what we take it to be.
I guess the word, I like playing with this idea of the word illusion, right? Because the Eastern philosophers that I've studied have explored some of this idea. The snake, coming back to that snake, when the snake frightens us, if it was a true illusion in the sense that it didn't ever exist, how could it have caused you fear, right? So there's a quasi reality. The thing is that the thoughts that you have, the beliefs that you have a reality about them. They have a reality in the sense that they motivate your actions. They cause you to do this, that, and the other. In fact, one of the most significant things you often do in life seem to be based on rather ephemeral notions. So to dismiss them as non-existent and completely,
the illusion exists. The illusion is real, but it's an illusion.
Yes. So Kay, I think, talks about seeing the true and the false and so on. That language is trying to point to this kind of relationship, this relationship between something that is sort of unnecessary and causes you grief. If you were able to see and understand it, you might recognize you don't like that? Well, clarify then a little bit.
False or it's not, to be clear.
Well, why are you creating such a strong dichotomy? What is it why are you so concerned about the notion of falsehood and truth? Can I at least ask that? Because there seems to be an obsession to know what is true and what is false, and to categorize these in such a way that either makes you feel secure or reinforces a sense of I'm just asking. I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
I don't want to live in illusion. I have a great deal of evidence that the sense of self is illusory. I don't want to live in illusion. I want to be clearer whether that should be. I don't want to live a life of falseness. It has no meaning to live a life of falseness. On any basis whatsoever. I don't want to be deluded.
Can we start with, at least can I stop for a moment? So, very politely, why do you feel that you're living a life of falseness? What has made you think that you're living a life of falseness and are trying to find truth?
I don't assert that categorically. I say there's a lot of evidence, especially from Krishnamurti's teaching, that this sense of self, which is fundamental to our lives, but that sense is illusory. And this seems to me the absolutely critical point in all the teachings that you're going to talk about Krishnamurti's sense of self. But I think we have to be clear about this most basic point. Is that thing illusory or not? If you want to talk about, well, who cares if it's illusory? That's another matter. I don't want to live in illusion.
I don't know if I'm saying who cares about it. I'm just asking that the point of departure is taking an assumption that this, at this very moment, to some extent, embedded in your question is the idea of the way the world is already. You take that as a fact that there's illusion built into it, and that you don't want to abide in this illusion, and you want to live in a place of truth. So when I hear that, for me, I automatically sort of already see a conception of reality and a conception of self within that reality, and a desire to move away from that reality into something else. Now, are you speaking existentially at this moment about the way the world is to you? Or is this an idea of the world as you have experienced it, your experience and memory, and the way you anticipate and experiencing it, other than from this moment into your imaginary future? We've already left the moment and moved into abstraction.
So you don't acknowledge the reality that many of us live with and in illusion.
May I point out a fact that might get in this dialogue? Krishnamurti started a dialogue in Untitled, in which I attended. He started the dialogue with the question, where does the self end and the other begin? That doesn't sound like he's treating it completely as an illusion. An important part of his teaching is that self-knowledge is to put everything in its right place, right? Sex in its right place, money in its right place, relationship in its right place, and so on. And you don't know what that right place is, so self-knowledge is to learn this art, putting things, everything in its proper place. So can it be that he is saying, what is the right place of what you call the self?
Mhm.
Or is it something to be completely eliminated?
I think those are important things, although upon hearing them, I could create in my head this idea that, oh my gosh, I don't have sex in its right place, and I don't have such and such. I wonder what that right place is. So now let me construct some ideas of what that is. I should be celibate. I should be, have fidelity to my one partner. So, and the environment, I should be such and such. So, but maybe putting things in their right place is something that one does at this moment. It's in fact, it's either in its right place now or it's not. And perhaps if you don't think about the issue, it is in its right place right now, right? But we go, well, but how can you say that? The world is in such a terrible state, and look where we're heading. Again, I'm looking at the past, and I'm looking at the future, and imagining these things. But in this moment, everything is in its right place. Unless it's not. And if it's not, it's arising in your head that it is not. And you can see that. You can see that at this moment. At that moment. At that moment. Are we?
I like the toothbrush. And
Not the underwear.
the sneakiness of the world. And in those places of the residual, what David was calling the residual self, the part that is acquiring memory and functioning in the world with its toothbrush and its map and its whatnots. There seems to be a lot of kind of butt again. Yeah, I won't start over for sure. That in that realm of practical self, there's a lot to say about evaluating that realm, whether it's functioning well or not.
Absolutely. In that relative self that functions in the world.
Yeah.
That's where a ton of work is done. That's where we work on ourselves, and I go and do yoga and eat well and work on the environment and all of those things. But there's something else that's being pointed to, which is that those so-called, I don't want to create kind of a dichotomy between those two. In that, when it's misunderstood and identified with so firmly and held on to, then it becomes problematic, because the idea of working with a relative self so that you're a cordial person and say hello to people and all of that, just being a social being. I mean, those skills that we have in life, when they start to loom large to where, we end up becoming conflicted and grasp after becoming a particular way or reaching some ideal of selfhood, then, the pendulum has swung to a place where there's a problem that, again, one just needs. There's a, well, yeah, and I think, again, choiceless awareness of that might allow you to understand that process and that movement. Everything is a process in action. Everything is a movement, and awareness might allow an understanding of that tendency in being human. That it's not about, oh, I've got to fix it or stop it, because saying that is this very process playing itself out. problematizing it, right? So to try to distinguish between the relative self and the absolute self or the ideal self, this is a problem that we face on the spiritual quest. This idea that the relative me, the deluded self that's grasping and so on, can be freed into something greater. That idea tends to move us sometimes away from examining the unfolding of the problematic, so-called problematic self. And maybe in the observation of that, you discover there might be no problem. The idea of giving it this category of being problematic is itself problematic. I think you had a question and we ignored you all the way around. Time to break? I think we're out. Are we out of time? Oh.
Really, I just wondered if maybe as I observe the rope and the snake, I'm not filled with any ego relationship. I'm just an observation. But the moment I sense danger, that this is not the rope that I thought, and this is going to destroy me, then my ego begins to work to try and preserve myself. Maybe even if you insult me, and if I attach myself to my image, then I'm again fearful and fearing of your opinion of me, and therefore I have to assert myself. Is it maybe just coming into being related to danger or related to something else?
The self?
Because before that, I was walking
Yeah.
happy.
Well, Krishnamurti also says acquisitiveness, right? So fear is one engine that seems to drive it, but desire is another, because I may want to be something. I don't just want you to think. I'm not just afraid that you'll think badly of me as I stand here. I want you to think well of me. I want you to think that, well, this guy really knows his stuff. He's like got some insight into such and such. So my movement towards self-aggrandizement is one form of grasping and clutching, while my fear of being thought of badly is my other drive. So these two driving mechanisms drive me. Yeah, but sometimes they're both regarded as acquisitiveness or desire, because one is the desire not to get bitten by the snake, and one is the desire not to be thought of well. So it's both a sense of wanting more. It's our greed. Intrinsically, it's a greediness to become, to grow, to somehow expand, and perhaps that's a natural drive in life, but it can get out of kilter and cause a lot of grief.
Out of kilter when you're not satisfied with just a simple toothbrush, but you want dozens or that you want them made of gold. So that's the best of it.
Yeah.
And then you have more, so I want to.
I think so. I think it's just, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what the right life is for a person to live. What is adequate? Perhaps one toothbrush is not enough, and perhaps one needs gold toothbrushes and all the rest of it. I don't know. Maybe no toothbrush. Maybe a toothbrush is not necessary also. So, right?
And I have something of an impression that as time went on, Krishnamurti moved increasingly to singling out thinking as the main human problem. In fact, as I, in my own research, have found very many direct references in him to what is the self. He does quite frequently mention some manifestation of the self. But as time goes on, and since the self is a product of thought, then thought is the problem here. By being limited inherently based on experience and knowledge. Now, it's interesting that Kay himself tells Bone that when the brother died, that experience convinced Krishnamurti himself of the limitations of thought. And later on, he says that that is clearly an experience which shows you the need for something going beyond thought. And that seeing of something important beyond thought gives you the energy for that to come about. I just thought I would mention that because we are talking about, Kay's view of self. I can't resist on David's point saying that I once heard a BBC program in which a celebrity was being interviewed about which musical discs they would take if they were on a desert island. And at some point in this half-listened to program, the interviewer said, most of us go through life like frauds, afraid we're going to be found out. And I thought, well, if the self is an illusion and an inadequate illusion created by inherently limited thought, that is a very natural state to be in.
Good point. Patrick, we'll come back to your question, or okay, yes.
It looks to me like I'm the only professional philosopher in the room, so let me start ruining this a bit for you by from time to time being the conceptual policeman. So all this illusion talk is conceptual nonsense. The self could not be an illusion because it belongs to the concept of an illusion that it is had by someone. An epistemic subject, as philosophers would say, a knowing self. So whatever it is, it cannot be an illusion. This whole romantic illusion talk is something for the New Age bookstore. It's for people who entertain themselves with romantic notions. But if you want to be just minimally intellectually honest and clear, it cannot be an illusion, because that would imply that there is somebody who has this illusion.
But the real illusion. Does illusion ever exist?
Yes, I mean, terms have well-defined meanings. Illusions are misperceptions that have a stimulus, like when you see a bent stick going through a water surface. Hallucinations are misperceptions that don't have an external stimulus. And self-consciousness is none of those two options we have, I think.
Why?
Why?
So you acknowledge that illusions do exist.
Yes.
And that people live in illusion to some extent.
Yes, for example, there are no colored objects in this world, as you all know. I hope your physics teacher told you in school. In front of your eyes, there are only wavelength mixtures. The whiteness, the blueness, the greenness are just properties of models of objects your brain creates.
That's not what I mean by illusion.
See, but that's the standard use of the term.
No.
But so if you want to use the term illusion in another way,
illusion means I think there's a green monster sitting on the roof, but there's not.
That's hallucination. And a hallucination is always something that is had by someone. So if the self is a hallucination, then there is a self behind the self that has that hallucination.
But there's also, can I just jump in? There's also error. So to some extent, this idea that thought is not the thing. So the thought David Moody is not David Moody. My idea of you is not you, let's say. And we frequently do this. A photograph of the thing is an image of the thing. If I mistake the image for the thing itself, that's error, right? I think quite often what is being pointed to is that thought, when it's misunderstood as the thing rather than the thought, is error. And we sometimes fall prey to error. Thought is always representational of something. It's not always, but much of the time. And our error is in mistaking the representation for the thing itself. The thing itself, this is the thing itself. Thisness, what is. I cannot put this into thought, but when I do put it into thought and call it this or call it, then I'm reducing this to a word, to an idea, to a concept. I do the same thing for self, Hillary, and so on. That thought is not the thing. It's a thought about the thing. I mistake one for the other, and I'm in error. These errors cause grief and cause conflict quite often.
I think I understand you and would agree. I would say that if that error is systematic and pervasive, it qualifies as a kind of illusion. Now, let's leave aside what I think for the moment, at least what I think about illusion. Let's talk about what Krishnamurti thinks for a moment. I would maintain, subject to your correction, I'm not absolute authority, it is my impression that embedded in the teachings of Krishnamurti is the notion that there is such a thing as illusion. Illusion is pervasive in the teachings, and it is fundamental to the teachings that the self-image is one of those illusions. And now we may debate that and say, oh no, there's no such thing as illusion. Why do you not want to live in illusion? And that's fine, we can debate that, but we should be clear that if we're going to take that tack, we have put aside the fundamental features of Krishnamurti philosophy, rejected it, and said, oh, we're going to correspond with some other point of view.
Could it be possible that as we meet here, more than 3 decades after his death, we come to clearer and better concepts than he did?
Yes, but we should acknowledge that we are separating ourselves completely from that philosophy which brought us here.
So Krishnamurti often uses the term image, and I see you through images and so on, and thought. I'm not so sure he uses the word illusion that significantly, although he, but because he tends to use different language. Illusion is sort of Maya. It's kind of part of a Eastern philosophy language. Nevertheless, when I'm constantly seeing the world through the filters of my thinking, constantly interacting with it through the filters of thinking, and I call it my thinking, rather than thought, then I'm seeing images of stuff. I'm basically watching a virtual reality and going through life that way. I mean, that is at the core of what Krishnamurti is pointing to. If you say that's an illusion and seeing through it is essential, I'd say, fine, that's Krishnamurti is trying to tell us to see through it. But he isn't saying this, that you see, the thought-constructed reality, the image-making process is he's acknowledging its power, because its power causes conflict in the world. It causes personal conflict. It is very much at the core of what human beings do. It's what drives the world in its passion, its politics, and so on. Right? He's pointing to a deeper understanding of the truth about the way the world is, which is this overlaying of image making atop something vaster, something more profound. But you don't get there by imagining that thing, because to imagine that thing and want to abide there is really just another thought-constructed entity. That's what I was trying to get at. You get to an understanding of that which is deeper by looking at the photograph. You could looking at the thought, but when there's awareness of the thought that arises, through that, there's the possibility of understanding. Because this image-making potential and propensity is going on at this very moment. I'm using words to speak. We're speaking with each other. We have an idea that's being reacted to. Oh, no, that can't be right because yada, 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 you know? And no, in fact, yes, I agree with you because you're right on the same page as I am. Do you know what I mean? We're constantly judging, enforcing, reinforcing, collectively constructing the self moment to moment at this very moment.
So there's just a couple things going on here. One is, what is in fact the case? What is true and actual with respect to consciousness? But there's another issue going on, which is, what does Krishnamurti say about it? And as I understand it, I may be mistaken, as I understand it, this conference was called to discuss what is the sense of self. And one portion of the conference, you very bravely took on the responsibility to articulate what is Krishnamurti's sense of what is the self. And all I'm trying to say really fundamentally is that my understanding of the teachings is that the concept of illusion is very active, very present in Krishnamurti's teachings, very much alive and well, notwithstanding professional philosophy, and that it is his point of view that the self is illusory. That's my understanding of what Krishnamurti says. Leave aside what is in fact the case. And I didn't quite hear that in your exposition of what Krishnamurti says, and that is the only basis for all of the questions I've put here today.
Well, thank you. I think I may have avoided that precisely because it can be a pitfall, which is to construct the notion of self as illusion and something beyond. I mean, something I was trying to hammer at, you know, it's I think was already raised earlier when Yap presented his notion, right? When one uses the concept self, which is our focal point, we've already moved to examining a term, a concept within a particular articulation of something. And to frame it as illusion is to suddenly have moved already from the discovery of what that might mean at this very moment. I think what Krishnamurti is pointing us to is not about getting rid of the self necessarily. Yeah, self-discovery is important. He's pointing us to the discovery of what is unfolding at this very moment, here and now. That's where everything can be found. Everything that can be discovered in answer to these questions, these burning questions, is at this very moment. So the idea of the self and how Krishnamurti talks about it and what its implications are and so on, yeah, they're interesting intellectual ideas and but at the core, that's not what I think he's really talking about. What he's pointing us to is this moment, the dynamics of what are unfolding at this very moment is revealing the nature of the self in action. Whether it's illusion or not, you can call it what you will, but I think this is the gist of his teaching. So the teachings on the self are really pointing us to what's unfolding right here, right now, at this very moment. That's what I think he is, not talking about the idea of something.